So last week was Father's Day. It's a day where kids and their fathers spend time together, profess their love, and there's great harmony. Today is not Father's Day, and I'm going to make fun of my kids. They say silly things, thinking that they're right or that they can fool their parents, but they are wrong. We will ask them, did you flush the toilet after you went poop? That's right, we're talking about poop. They say yes. When this question is asked by a parent, the wise parents have already seen the disgusting evidence in the toilet. So when they say yes, they have flushed the toilet, we know the answer is no. They know that yes is the good answer, and that's what they give, but it is rarely true in these situations. But it's still the answer that is given. We ask a boy who is squirming and holding his penis, poop and penis, if he needs to go pee. The answer is usually no. 5 minutes later, he's running inside to go pee with a sudden urgency that clearly his parents did not predict. Again, the parents know the answer before they ask. Other than the times when it seems that the penis holding is nervousness or purely recreational. Different issue there. A time to discuss what is socially acceptable at what time. The other one that is funny to observe, but less funny for the parent, is a very cranky child being told they are tired and need a nap, only for them to yell back at their parents that they aren't tired. I don't think a non-tired kid has ever had to yell at his parents to insist that he or she isn't tired. Parents know things, and we can tell what our kids need or have done even when they won't admit it. Electronics provide a whole new level where a parent can appear all-knowing. Your kids will come to you and say, Netflix won't work, the tablet isn't working, the Nintendo Switch is broken. And in a matter of seconds in some cases, and in the worst case a few minutes, my superior knowledge has turned this tragedy into a celebration. Outside of Father's Day or my birthday, this is when Nolan tells me he loves me, when I fix his shows. These are situations when it's easy to be the hero. I set up this technology for us, so I am generally able to get it working again. This is very similar to how things work when we interact with God, the Heavenly Father. It's like he knows how the internet is set up for the house, but instead of being limited to restarting the modem, the secret, he knows how we work in our entirety, how we're wired, and how everything else around us works as well. We see this come up in the passage we're looking at today, so let's re-engage with where we left off in Exodus. First, some bad news. We're at the part of Exodus not covered in the Prince of Egypt. Last week, Dave went through the parting of the Red Sea, which other than a scene that shows Moses with the tablets holding the Ten Commandments, is essentially where the movie ends. So they're now essentially free. The Egyptian army and chariots have been washed away. They're safe from pursuit. But this is millions of people wandering in the desert, so there are problems. Let's read. It says, Then Moses led the people of Israel away from the Red Sea, and they moved out into the desert of Shur. They traveled in this desert for 3 days without finding any water. When they came to the oasis of Marah, the water was too bitter to drink, so they called the place Marah, which means bitter. Then the people complained and turned against Moses. What are we going to drink? They demanded. So pretty reasonable complaints here. 3 days in the desert in an arid climate is about all people can take without having a drink, without dying. It does say that it had been 3 days since they found water, not since they had anything to drink. So maybe they weren't on the brink of death, but still this is a pretty understandable gripe. It doesn't take much forward thinking to realize that with no source of water, they will not last long in the desert. So Moses does what he should as a leader of millions who also doesn't know where to get water. He consults with God. It says, So Moses cried out to the Lord for help, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. Moses threw it into the water, and this made the water good to drink. So when asked for help, God comes through. He provided a source of drinking water to keep his people alive in the desert. This happens quite a few times in Exodus. They're wandering, need water. God comes through in those cases as well. But this one's pretty interesting. God directs Moses to a specific piece of wood to throw into the water, which makes it okay to drink. So in this situation, who or what made this water drinkable? Was it God or was it the branch? And as a reminder, this is the same God who made the Nile River run red with blood, brought plagues of darkness, frogs, flies, and even death on the Egyptians. Most of us watched Prince of Egypt, other than Dave, who it sounds like still has not watched. Um, so clearly God could have just made the water drinkable. But it does say that the Lord showed him a piece of wood, Moses threw it into the water, and this made the water good to drink. It certainly reads like there was some property of this piece of wood that was able to neutralize whatever it was in the water that made it bitter and undrinkable. I did some research on this. There are several articles on what this could have been. It is also fully possible and well within God's power that this was just the medium that he used to perform a miracle and that there was nothing special about this particular branch at all. But I tend to read this a little bit more on the side of this is God's children crying out for help and him saying, oh, the water's bitter? Just take this branch and throw it in there. God knows what's wrong with the water. He knows the sort of chemical or other reaction the branch will cause in the water and knows it will fix the problem. Because he made the water, he made the branch, and he certainly didn't lead his people out of Egypt to die of thirst in the desert. It's like when Netflix suddenly isn't working and Dad knows it just means the modem needs to be reset. Dad set up the internet. He's seen Netflix stop working before. It's not a big deal when you know how to fix it, and all it takes is the child asking. Moving on, the next verse kind of sets the stage for the rest of the book of Exodus. It says, "It was there at Merah that the Lord set before them the following decree, as a standard to test their faithfulness to him. He said, if you will listen carefully to the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in his sight, obeying his commands and keeping all his decrees, then I will not make you suffer any of the diseases I sent on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you." This is just one of the many places in the Bible, even in the book of Exodus, where God tells his people, listen to me, obey my commands, and things will go well. This all seems very good and logical. Our God, our maker, is saying, hey, I know what's best for you. I am the one who created you. I'm going to tell you to save you a lot of pain and hardship, the right way to live. But like every kid ever, we tend to decide that we know better or that we want to try things our own way. It's no different for the Israelites. Let's read the next passage when they again are in trouble and seeking help. Water has been taken care of, so biologically, food is the next problem. It says, then the whole community of Israel set out for Elim and journeyed into the wilderness of Sin. I believe it's Sin, because it's like Sinai, not Sin. Between Elim and Mount Sinai. They arrived there on the 15th day of the second month, 1 month after leaving the land of Egypt. There, too, the whole community of Israel complained about Moses and Aaron. If only the Lord had killed us back in Egypt, they moaned. There we sat around pots filled with meat and ate all the bread we wanted. But now you have brought us into this wilderness to starve us all to death. 1 month after leaving Egypt, they left with provisions and livestock. So again, they haven't had no food for a month, but likely rations have dwindled and there is no clear source of food for the millions of people and their animals. We often read this saying that people had no faith, which is probably fair. But if you're one of 2.4 million people, which is an estimate of how many there were at the time, with no clear food source in the month since you've left Egypt, I don't know, I kind of get it. I'm sure food is being consumed at a crazy rate and it does not seem to be getting replenished. And I get cranky and complaining after no food for like 6 hours, and with the prospect of food in the future being pretty much rock solid. So anyway, let's see what happens with the whiny Israelites. Then the Lord said to Moses, I have heard the Israelites' complaints. Now tell them, in the evening you will have meat to eat, and in the morning you will have all the bread you want. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God. That evening, vast numbers of quail flew in and covered the camp, and the next morning the area around the camp was wet with dew. When the dew evaporated, a flaky substance as fine as frost blanketed the ground. The Israelites were puzzled when they saw it. What is it? They asked each other. They had no idea what it was. And Moses told them, it is the food the Lord has given you to eat. These are the Lord's instructions. Each household should gather as much as it needs. Pick up 2 quarts for each person in your tent. Again, we see that God provides for the people when they cry out to him. And God has shown himself to be faithful in providing for his people. And this time, I'm not aware of any sort of natural phenomenon where something like dew turns into food that you can pick up and eat. I think this would have been unbelievably incredible to live through. every time I read this, I want to try it. I want to see what the manna was like. It says later on, because I think that's probably a normal thing even for people who lived much closer this time, it says that it was white like coriander seed and it tasted like honey wafers. I don't know much about coriander seed or honey wafers. That didn't help me a whole lot. I don't know. But in the same part of the text, it says that God instructed Moses to collect some of this manna, that they called it, for future generations so they could see the food that God provided during their time in the desert. Unfortunately, it was put in the Ark of the Covenant, which has been lost. Even though we think Indiana Jones found it, that didn't stick. Perhaps Dora the Explorer can take over. If you didn't know, there's a live action Dora the Explorer movie coming out. So maybe she can fix this. Anyway, so God provides food for his people while they're in the desert. Despite being witnesses to yet another miracle, things don't go exactly as planned. Let's read the instructions God gives to Moses, and Moses passes along to the people. It says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Look, I'm going to rain down food from heaven for you. Each day the people can go out and pick up as much food as they need for that day. I will test them in this to see whether or not they will follow my instructions. On the 6th day they will gather food, and when they prepare it, there will be twice as much as usual.' Then Moses told them, 'Do not keep any of it until morning.' But some of them didn't listen and kept some of it until morning. But by then it was full of maggots and had a terrible smell. Moses was very angry with them." So God tells them through Moses that they don't need to save any, that he will continue to provide for them. Some of the people don't listen, and disgusting things happen. The food spoils, turns into maggots. Once again, we see people not that similar to us or our children being given clear instructions on what the best thing to do is and not listening. Let's keep going, though. The part I want to talk about more is coming up. It says, "On the 6th day, they gathered twice as much as usual, 4 quarts for each person instead of 2. Then all the leaders of the community came and asked Moses for an explanation. He told them, 'This is what the Lord commanded. Tomorrow will be a day of complete rest, a holy Sabbath set apart for the Lord. So bake or boil as much as you want today and set aside what is left for tomorrow.' So they put some aside until morning, just as Moses had commanded, and in the morning the leftover food was wholesome and good, without maggots or odor." So this is interesting, and again, in this case, it's doing the exact same thing one day versus the other. One when God says it's the right thing to do, one where he says it isn't. In one case, the food spoils and becomes full of maggots, which is disgusting. In the other case, it is still good and it is preserved because it is in line with what God asked them to do. So this is also the first time that God gives the Sabbath to his people. It actually shows up here. We generally think of it as coming in through the Ten Commandments and the covenant, but this is actually the first time that the Sabbath is brought up. And this is where I want to spend the rest of our time, on this idea of a Sabbath. And to kind of jump off, there is a little bit more that will inform our discussion in the next few verses. So let's read ahead. It says, "Moses said, 'Eat this food today, for today is a Sabbath day dedicated to the Lord. There will be no food on the ground today. You may gather the food for 6 days, but the 7th day is the Sabbath. There will be no food on the ground that day.' Some of the people went out anyway on the 7th day, but they found no food. The Lord asked Moses, 'How long will these people refuse to obey my commands and instructions? They must realize that the Sabbath is the Lord's gift to you.'" This is what I want to key on, the Sabbath being God's gift to people, to us. God is saying that I have provided enough for you so that you don't need to work on this day. Go ahead and rest. This is my gift to you. We also see that some of the people don't accept the gift and try to go out and work on that day anyway, which is a little silly because their food comes from God and he told them there wouldn't be any, but they try to go gather some anyway. And so like I mentioned earlier, this is not a commandment that just lives in this portion of the Bible. It's not like I plucked out some rare occurrence. This is in the Ten Commandments, and it really is a recurring theme throughout the Old Testament. Jesus teaches on it as well. It was a huge deal, and is, I think, a huge deal in Jewish culture and religion. So Jesus teaches on it. We'll get a little bit more into that, but he says similar to what God said in this passage. He says that It says, then Jesus said to them, the Sabbath was made to meet the needs of people and not people to meet the requirements of the Sabbath. So similarly, from the first passage we read in this one, I think when you take it as a whole, the teaching in the Bible on the Sabbath is God saying, I made you, I know how you work best, and you work best when you work 6 days and rest on the seventh day. Unfortunately, similar to the people going out to gather manna on the Sabbath, I think we're generally pretty bad at this. At least I am bad at it, so at least one out of the people in this room is bad at this. Before we kind of dive into how to do this well, I want to look a little closer at the attitudes and motivation behind not being willing to take a rest. So if we start with the passage, the people in the desert, the Israelites in the desert, they've been slaves for a long time. I would imagine as slaves in Egypt that there were not a lot of rest days given. And they have just gone to the point of nearly dying, first of thirst, and then a couple weeks later moving towards starvation and an exhausted food supply. And I feel like I keep excusing their lack of faith and trusting God, but it is not hard to understand in that set of circumstances that they may be trying to make sure that they do not get to the brink of death again from a gathering food and water standpoint. They're trying to build up some reserves when they go out there and do some more. They're saving up for a vacation or for retirement or maybe even building up an emergency fund. But in their case, I guess that's all just in case God forgets them one day, which I think is the problem, is that their food supply is directly from God. So when they're saving up, it's very much not trusting in God to continue to provide for them. I do think that this applies to us as well. It is just less direct because our food, comes from a grocery store with our money and not, laying on the ground of the desert for us to pick up from God. I think to take this into our situation, this is similar when we feel like we just can't take a day off. And I don't think this actually means having a job where you have to work 7 days a week. I think even when it comes to work around the house or what we would call productivity, productivity it's productive to be working on your household budget, or it's productive to be installing a new light in the bathroom, or it's productive to be outside taking care of the yard or going through boxes and clearing things out. Those are all things that we consider productive around the house. Whereas we see things that are traditionally rest or recreation as a lazy thing to do on a normal weekend. If it's vacation, that's one thing. But a normal weekend day, that's when we get groceries, when we mow the lawn, or do whatever is on our never-ending list of things that need to happen for our lives to be clean, to be secure, and to be the way that we want them to be. And this sort of drive to always be working, always to be pushing ourselves is unhealthy physically, it's unhealthy emotionally, and it's unhealthy spiritually. In these passages, God is telling us that we were designed to rest. And I think we should listen to him. We'll do a little more on how to do that practically later, but first I want to expand on what Jesus said about the Sabbath and the people that he was saying it to. This passage from the Gospel of Mark. This is kind of the full passage of what I read earlier. It says, one Sabbath day as Jesus was walking through some grain fields, his disciples began breaking off heads of grain to eat. But the Pharisees said to Jesus, look, why are they breaking the law by harvesting grain on the Sabbath? Jesus said to them, haven't you read in the scriptures what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He went into the house of God during the days when Abiathar was high priest and broke the law by eating the sacred loaves of bread that only the priests are allowed to eat. He also gave some to his companions. Then Jesus said to them, the Sabbath was made to meet the needs of people and not people to meet the requirements of the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even over the Sabbath. So the earlier passage in Exodus, we talked about how the context there was God giving the Sabbath to his people. They were full of worry. Their bent was to always be working because of their anxiety to have enough food and water. When Jesus came, the people, especially the Pharisees, had kind of swung the other way. They had written volume upon volume of what could and could not be done on the Sabbath and had taken adherence to the Sabbath to kind of crazy levels. For example, you could tie knots that could be untied with one hand on the Sabbath, but not ones that required two hands to untie. And in the passage we saw, harvesting grain is one of the things that was forbidden on the Sabbath, but even harvesting grain such that you're walking the entire time, grabbing things and just rubbing it with your hands so that you can eat it was considered too much work on the Sabbath because it was specifically harvesting grain. So into this culture where things have gotten a little overheated on adherence to the Sabbath, Jesus defends the actions of his disciples, saying that the Sabbath was made to meet the needs of people and that the Son of Man, Jesus, is Lord even over the Sabbath. We could spend more time here, but it's not really what I want to emphasize. Jesus is not saying at all here that the Sabbath doesn't apply anymore. What he is saying is that the Pharisees and people who have focused on this so legalistically have taken things too far. And I think the way that I would kind of compare this in our lives is that, kind of like I mentioned earlier, the instruction, and everywhere this is preached in the Bible, the instruction is to take 1 day out of 7 to rest. So unlike our normal 5-day work week, or on the weeks like this one where some of us get a 3-day weekend, it doesn't mean that you get 2 to 3 days of rest in a week just because that's what your employer gave you. Referring back to what I said earlier, there are things that we do that we consider productive, and they are necessary. I kind of said them like, don't try to be overly productive before, but these are very important things, even though they're not part of our actual jobs or our school if you're a student. If we work 5 days a week, that 6th day is when we should be doing our work at home, the productive activities that we talked about. So, like, for example, golfing all day on Saturday and watching football all day on Sunday isn't a Sabbath. It's getting into the selfish/lazy territory because that would be working 5 days and resting 2. Strangely, despite thinking that and I do think this, that we generally kind of have a workaholic type culture, I also think there's a strong push towards having like tons of leisure time. And I definitely feel the pull of both of these things. There are times when I feel like I can't take a minute off to do anything to rest on the weekend, but then there are also times when I will strongly resist doing anything but just relaxing when I'm not at work. All right, now I want to spend the rest of our time talking through what I think taking a Sabbath looks like in various stages of our lives. Because while I think this teaching is good in general and makes a lot of sense, it's also a thing where if we don't have an actual plan of what we're going to do, it's unlikely that anything will change. So like what actually counts as Sabbath activities? Is it a day of one long session of prayer and Bible study? Are you allowed to watch Netflix? Can I go on a hike? Can I go work out? So I think some of those depend, but I'm going to start with an overarching statement. Things that restore your energy, restore your motivation, and restore your reserves should be part of your Sabbath. Things that do the opposite should not. After your Sabbath, you should be more equipped to love your kids, your family, your friends, your classmates, and your coworkers because you've been refreshed. And I do think that this works differently for different people. For instance, introverts and extroverts refresh differently. So like if you're an introvert, you're going to need some time alone to refresh. An extrovert will need time with people. Also, some people refresh and feel restored by doing things like gardening, whereas yard work makes me not like my life. So that's different. I do think that some time with God should be part of a Sabbath. I also think it should be a part of every day. But worship, prayer, and reading the Bible are certainly good Sabbath activities. All right, let's talk through some specifics now. I'm going to go through maybe 2.5 scenarios of someone's life situation and what I think a Sabbath could look like. In no way am I saying this is exactly what it should look like. This is just kind of trying to apply it so that we can all do the same thing in our lives. So let's start out with a student. And to clarify, like I said, there's certainly room to adjust with these things. First, I would recommend for a student probably doing Sunday. If you're not going to do Sundays, Saturday would probably be the second best. I guess if you have Friday off, I know a lot of people end up with no classes on Friday. That potentially works too. So first one, and why I picked those days, you should not have school and you should not be doing homework or studying. School essentially is your job, and it is a very easy job to make it a 7-day-a-week type of thing. This is probably where all of the main level of anxiety with being a student is probably all around your performance in school, which is a good indication that it should be something that you're taking a break with when you're taking a Sabbath or taking a break from. So this would mean that you need to plan so that you get all your assignments done on the other 6 days. So if something is due on Monday and your Sabbath is going to be Sunday, that means you need to get it done on Saturday, or if you like to live dangerously and procrastinate, Monday morning. Another thing I think you should be doing is spend some time with God. Sunday is a good choice because church is a clear way to do that. There's worship built in, prayer, community. These are all good things for your Sabbath and a good way to recharge. I would recommend taking a nap. If you've been up late studying or not studying, because college was fun and sometimes you just stay up late doing things, the other 6 days, you're likely sleep deprived and you probably need to catch up. Sleeping is healthy. You should take naps and recover if you have not been sleeping enough. And then last one, spend some time doing a thing or some things that you enjoy. Watching a movie is fine. Working out is fine. Playing video games is fine. Do not let these leisure activities be all that you do on a Sabbath, but if these are things you enjoy that are restful and restorative to you, then they are a good part of a Sabbath day. That's really probably the part that changes for each person a little bit more, but hopefully we all know ourselves well enough that we know things that we like to do that both restore us and drain us. All right, next I'm gonna kind of go what I would say the other end of the spectrum for our churches, and then most of the other things I think will be kind of in between those, which is someone like me who has a normal job, who's married with kids. What does a Sabbath look like then? And full disclosure, I am not great at this, and I'm certainly not intentional about it. So some amount of this is, I'm speaking on this, I really should be better at it. What should I do? So anyway, first, I would recommend either Saturday or Sunday. Those are the days that I pretty much always have off. It incorporates church and worship, which is a good part of the Sabbath. Second, don't work. I have a bad habit at times, not habit, I don't do it all the time, but working on weekends is something that I occasionally do. That would not be something that would be incorporated into an actual Sabbath. Go to church, worship, pray, be in community. Again, Sunday makes this a good day for that because it builds in some of that time. This is important with kids because it can very much feel like when you have kids that there are no breaks. Time spent at kids' activities, I would say, can be part of your Sabbath. And I'll get to more kids stuff in a minute. If you're an introvert like me, try to avoid things like kids' birthday parties and similar activities that drain you. Sometimes you can drop them off and come back and pick them up later. Spend time doing things that you enjoy, both alone and with your family. This is an important thing. Like I said, I'm an introvert. It would be easy for me to say my Sabbath is me hanging out by myself, but then Lacey has the kids the entire time, which is not fair, right, at all. So some of these things that you enjoy need to be family activities or activities with your spouse, which is actually not restrictive at all. There are things that are restful, restorative, and involve spending time as a family and growing that as well. So those are very good things, and I would say for anyone with significant friends, spouses, anything like that, spending time with people, is good. I think there should usually be some alone time in a Sabbath, but there are certainly things that we do together that help build up and restore you. I've got for me workout. I think that there are a few things like this that can go either way. If working out is something that you kind of dread and that drains you, probably shouldn't be on there. If it is something that you kind of feel better and refreshed, maybe not immediately afterwards, but shortly thereafter, then I think it's probably a good thing for a Sabbath. And I also put don't work on your at-home to-do list activities. These are for the non-Sabbath weekend day. I'll just skip ahead. So the other thing that when I try to apply this to my life is I think it is, maybe I'm going too far. It doesn't say this in the Bible. I think it's probably okay for your Sabbath to be a little bit split between your weekend. Like for me, the thing that probably would work the best is my Sabbath being like dinner time on Saturday to dinner time on Sunday. Then I can, through Saturday, get things done on our to-do list, do projects. Starting Saturday night, spend some time with Lacey, either a date night or hanging out after the kids are in bed. Then Sunday church, we can have a good kind of family meal in the morning, have breakfast. And then there's time for a nap in the afternoon and doing some things we enjoy, either as a family or alone, reading to my kids, playing sports with them outside, that sort of stuff. To me, that is a very good Sabbath. And then, which this is why I'm a little shaky on whether this is okay. Part of that is because for planning out my next week at work, I usually do that Sunday night because we're about to get into it and get ready. It's a good time to do that. The alternative would be doing that on Saturday, which feels way worse to me. So that's kind of how I'm planning on applying this. One other interesting situation, which most of them are not here, but if you're a minister or someone who does so much volunteering here on Sunday that it's clearly not a good day to be your Sabbath. It's like for most of the people I just mentioned, I kind of had church as being part of it. But if you are, upfront serving or upfront, doing significant amounts of work, that's really not a good thing for your Sabbath at least. So the short answer is that your Sabbath needs to not be Sunday. If you're in full-time ministry, something like Monday or sometime during the week is probably a good choice. But if you also have a full-time job, I would say you got to shoot for Saturday at that point. And if you're like me and a day when you're speaking at church usually means you worked on your message on Saturday, I would at least go for the second half of Sunday. And frankly, if you're always working 5 days a week at a job and you're so involved here that a Sabbath is impossible, you probably need to pull back a little bit. God is pretty clear that that this is something that we're made to be doing, to take rests. And sometimes when ministry or serving at church is part of what's making that impossible, it feels like you're doing the right and good thing. I do not think that is what the Bible is saying. I think it's saying that you need to take a Sabbath or you will get burned out. The other one that I think is interesting and potentially hard, if you're a stay-at-home parent, it can very much feel like watching your kids is your job, and you can't really get a break from watching your kids because they don't go anywhere. I think for one thing, like I mentioned in my situation, that spending time with your kids needs to be incorporated into your Sabbath. It may be that the activities that you do during your Sabbath are different. I do think it's probably good for part of that day to get some amount of break from them. If it's a really young child, when they take a nap, actually rest and take a nap as well, as opposed to on other days where you may be trying to get your unending list of things done. But I mean, that's part of what's, there's certain parts of your life that don't end, and teaching your kids and incorporating them into what your Sabbath activities are, to rest together, to do things that are refreshing together, and spend kind of quality time together as opposed to trying to get 100 things done and kind of watch them at the same time and snapping at them as a result, that sort of thing. I think is kind of how you incorporate that. So yeah, I want to encourage everyone to think through what that looks like in your situation. How does a day of Sabbath look like for you? How can you spend time getting closer to God, being refreshed and restored, such that you're not burning yourself out, such that you can love people, the people in your lives, such that you have enough energy, that you've had enough rest to continue to live well and to be the type of person that you want to be. All right, so we're getting close to wrapping things up. I do want to bring up that this piece of how we're made to need rest and recovery goes beyond just a day of rest each week. One example, I listen to quite a few podcasts. Some of them get into interviews about work productivity. It's usually not like the focus of it, but they interview people who've written books and that sort of thing. All of the ones that have this sort of component over the last couple of years, there have been interviews with authors about the benefits of taking breaks throughout the day at work. It apparently increases productivity, creativity, and worker engagement. I think this is still fairly new research. It does not surprise me, but as far as there's a pretty wide range of okay, what does that look like? How often are you taking breaks? It seems like the sweet spot is about a 10 to 15 minute break every hour and a half to 2 hours. There's definitely research that says it's better if you get up and walk around. Walking around outside is better than just walking in a building. It says taking breaks with someone that you enjoy, talking about not work or completely disconnecting. These are apparently things that will help someone maintain a focus throughout their workday. It's kind of similar to the research that says, like, if you're going in for a medical procedure, don't go in the afternoon because way more mistakes happen. Go in the morning. It's kind of like the same thing. If people don't take breaks throughout the entire day, their performance gets worse toward the end. There's also, in the Bible, this passage on the Sabbath. It does first always talk about taking a Sabbath every single week, but then on a larger scale, the Bible talks about other times of rest. This is all in Leviticus 23 through 25, and here's the first passage. I won't read the whole thing, but it says, "In addition to the Sabbath, these are the Lord's appointed festivals, the official days of holy assembly that are to be celebrated at their proper times each year." So this passage in Leviticus is where festivals that we sometimes read, big events happening during, like the Passover, there's the Festival of Harvest, the Day of Atonement. These are all outlined during this period. And when you read through it, it kind of sounds like a list of sacrifices. It can sound pretty legalistic. And there certainly are prescribed rituals for these days. However, I think we lose sight of the fact that these days and these rituals were also celebrations. There were generally feasts surrounding them. If you read really carefully through the sacrifices that are listed, whenever it calls it a sacrifice, that means that it's something that's killed but then kind of eaten in a meal together. When it's a burnt offering, I believe it gets all the way burnt up, but when it says this is a sacrifice, it is something that is then kind of eaten in a celebratory meal. And in all of these cases, they are days off that had this prescription of doing no work. And so the 7 festivals that are in this passage, it adds up to about 2 to 3 weeks. 2 of them are a week long. The others are about a day each. I think this lines up pretty well with holidays and vacations for us. And I think we all realize when these things roll around that I think even if you're taking a regular Sabbath, that there are times when a week off or something like that is something that you really feel a need for, and I think can really be helpful. So, I mean, I just think that this is how God made us, both from taking small breaks during the day to recharge to week-long holidays or vacations. I think that our Maker tells us in the Bible that we were made to rest, to work 6 days and to rest on the 7th. And I pray that we would be humble enough to listen and disciplined enough to obey him. He knows us better than we know ourselves. It's very much like we are kids, and he is the dad who knows the modem just needs reset and that Netflix will work again.